Or the person who's coming in, come in first. Hi, Therese. So, welcome everybody, including those of you joining online. You can't see me, but I hope you can hear me. So this is the last of the centre's visiting speaker events. It's not the last of the centre events. There are a couple more research group meetings. There may be a centre away day. We haven't decided on that. And what there is, which I hope you picked up from your last email, is a 25th anniversary event on the afternoon of September the 18th. But returning to today, very happy to introduce you to Dr. Clayton Chin. He's the senior lecturer in political theory in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. His past research focused on the methodology of different traditions within political theory, particularly the relation between pragmatist political thought and the analytical continental approaches. The research focused on methodological debates in political theory, led to a variety of journal articles and a monograph, Practice of Political Theory and Rortian Continental Thought. And in fact, Clayton, who is here as a University of Bristol Next Generation Visiting Fellow, will be doing a talk on those kinds of methodology and political theory topics on that theme, specifically on, I believe, contextualism, on the afternoon of Monday the 24th. That's 2 p.m. Yeah. And that's being hosted by the school's political theory group. So if you're on that email list, you'll get details. If you're not, see me or Tim Fowler, who convenes the group. But as for today's talk, well, this actually relates to Clayton's more recent interests, which are to do with multiculturalism and cultural diversity in contemporary liberal democracies, particularly the relation between multiculturalism and national identity in both contemporary Western liberal democracies and theoretical debates. He focuses on the theorizing of the concept of belonging and its implication for our understanding of multiculturalism, national identity, and recognition. And he's published a variety of articles, a number of articles on these issues in Ethnicities, Nations and Nationalism, Journal of Intercultural Studies, and Ethnic and Racial Studies. And as you know, and as you can see from the slide, that is the theme that he'll be talking on today. So welcome, Clayton, as the Next Generation Visiting Fellow, and we look forward to your talk. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much as well to Tarek and to Space, is that right? To Space.
Yes, Space.
And to the university and obviously to the fellowship program. It's been great to come here and have so much time to talk to Tarek and to get my thoughts in order. As you mentioned, I'm primarily a political theorist. I come to these themes with that type of disciplinary background, and because I'm also, I guess, some sort of methodologist, I come to it with, very purposefully from that kind of approach and a consciousness, I guess, of the relationship between that approach and others. I've been writing for the last few years on the concept of belonging, and I'm coming to, I guess, the phase in it where I'm trying to say something, you might say, quasi-systematic about it. So I'm trying to say something large, and I'm trying to say something that makes sense altogether and provides a kind of framework for it. And so I'll apologize in the first instance because this is rather abstract, what I'm going to say. And it's because I'm kind of at that phase where I'm trying to get my mind around what I think about this topic overall, how I think people might want to study it, and what kinds of resources I think I can give to myself and others to do that. So I'll be trying to say something about that topic, and the paper kind of goes large and then goes in and then zooms in on that topic. So it is called The Question of Belonging, the Structure and Objects of Group Membership in Diverse Democracies. Slide going to change. Yes, it did. And to do that, I'll talk you through through a few issues. So I'll say something about the context of what I mean by a theory of belonging, and what I'm trying to do with theory of belonging. I'll say something a little bit about a notion I have called a structure to belonging, and what I think that structure might be. Part of that structure is that there are objects of belonging. And the main kind of bulk of the paper will then take us through debates in political theory that have tried to say something about these objects and what is of use and what is potentially not of use in those types of debates. And I run through kind of the major options of community, culture, and identity as things to which we might belong. And then I try and conclude after that kind of large smash of ideas. So, to start with a little bit of context, as I said, this paper sits within that larger project on belonging, and it tries to contribute to that project doing a couple things. The first thing that project tries to do is it tries to understand contemporary conflicts around diversity, political community, post-immigration communities, and national identity in terms of the concept of belonging. And what that means is that I'm trying to theorize something quite broad. When I talk about the concept of belonging, I'm trying to theorize the nature of what it means to belong to a group. So what it means for somebody, and this can be an individual or a group, and we'll say something more about that, to make claims to belong, right? To try and tie themselves to these things, these immaterial and complex things we call groups. So there's a big kind of theoretical question there, obviously, about how we understand the concept, how we understand its relationship with other concepts, and so on. The second part of that is normative, and it's the part that I haven't gotten to yet, but it's kind of, I guess, the impetus of this. We all have some kind of larger sociopolitical normative project that often, obviously, motivates why we talk about these topics, what we're trying to do. And broadly, like others in the field, I'm motivated by the idea that I'd like to be able to get to a point where I'm prescribing better forms of belonging broadly. So more inclusive, sustainable forms of political community and national identity that I think chime with the concerns that I have around diversity, around belonging claims and their place within contemporary political communities, especially, and the tensions that a lot of those belonging claims bring. Now, we might ask in the first instance, or I might choose to frame this by asking the question of why I'm talking about the concept of belonging, or why I think belonging is useful. On the one hand, the reason is kind of literature-based. In a certain sense, political theorists haven't thought that much about the concept of belonging, at least on an explicit level. And I'll qualify that a little bit in a couple of minutes when I say something about, when we start talking about political theory and what it has to say about this concept. But other cognate debates have lots to say about belonging. Most of those theorizations occur in the broader social sciences. Often they're very sociological. They're very useful to me, but they're also very different in terms of what they're trying to do. So in those types of debates, often belonging concerns how political communities are constructed and lived, how power, agency, and what a lot of scholars call the politics of belonging affect inclusion, how they create new forms of exclusion. So I'm thinking here of scholars like Nir Yuval Davis here in the UK, or Ghassan Haj in Australia, who offer critical analyses of the politics of belonging occurring between various groups, and particularly as they are affected by the new forms of inclusion and exclusion that have emerged in kind of late modern politics, even amongst, and often consciously in mind of, the supposedly kind of inclusive forms of politics we have nowadays. So, for example, Haj has a large critique of Australian multiculturalism and its kind of racialized underpinnings and the structures of belonging that create new forms of exclusion. Now, some of what I've done is looking at that literature and thinking about, how far they take us with the concept of belonging. And broadly, my understanding there is that these approaches tend to treat belonging as a kind of subjective experience of inclusion or non-inclusion in a group by subgroups or smaller groups or individuals in those groups who experience unequal forms of practical membership, right? They don't have the same types of capacities to direct the group. They don't have access to resources in the group in the same way, and so on, right? These analyses are often then focused on these unbelonging groups or excluded groups, let's say, in terms of their social location, and in terms of exposing how, when viewed through the lens of belonging, they suffer from deep inequalities that push them outside the mainstream in some type of a way. Now, as I said, that's all very important for me, and what I'm doing. I've drawn along a lot from that. In particular, I've written a lot about Hodge's work in some of my articles, but I also want to ask a different sort of question, in a certain sense, about belonging, or one that is inclusive of that, but maybe also tries to bring in some other issues.
Sorry to interrupt you, Clayton. Can I just check that people online can see your slide, because the picture that I can see on the screen is of you speaking, but not your slides. So have you pressed whatever you need to press so they can see it? Or maybe, Lauren, you could indicate to us with a thumbs up or whatever that you can see.
It's been
Lauren's
fine for
controlling the
me.
slide, so.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay. As long as everyone online can see the slides. I just wanted to check that. Sorry to.
No. I think that, Lauren's controlling the slides. I'm just changing them. I think is the complex technological solution that we've come up with here. Anyway, so I was going to say something about the approach that I take, and then kind of walk you through, I guess, what I'm trying to do here. Now, this approach is very much influenced, as Tariq mentioned, by some of my methodological work, and some of that work, especially in the current context, is very much influenced by a philosopher who you may or probably not wouldn't have heard of, called Robert Brahm, who's a contemporary philosopher of language in the US. Now, there's lots to say about this. This is a very complex theory. I don't think I understand that well myself, even though I've worked on philosophical pragmatism and philosophy of language for some time in my past. But the kind of key part for us here that I'm trying to motivate my work from is that Brahm has a particular conception of normativity and concept use. And he has a particular way of understanding what recognition is, particularly. And that's useful for me for thinking about what membership is, what it means to belong to groups. So I'm just going to read a couple long quotes. I'm sorry for that, and just bear with me. But I think it exposes a little bit about what I'm trying to do here in thinking through the notion of belonging. So Brahm says, this is actually from an interview, so it's clearer than he usually is. My notion of community and community membership is, first of all, a normative one, and second, a matter of who one attributes commitments and entitlements to. That is, the specific sorts of norms involved are what he calls deontic scorekeeping norms. That's a technical term we can put to the side, which is another way of saying that they are matters of specific recognition. Since to recognize someone in a particular respect is to attribute a responsibility or some sort of authority to her. So the notion of community has a lot more structure than, for instance, some communitarian views take it to have. And he goes on the more traditional I-we picture of communities and membership, the question is a binary one. Are you in or are you out? What are the criteria for being in the community? Where are the boundaries of community and who is out? On his model, the deontic scorekeeping, what he calls a recognitive picture, there's a lot more structure and things are more complicated. For one can recognize someone in some respects, but not in others. Attribute to someone some kinds of authority, acknowledge their capacity to undertake certain kinds of responsibilities and not others. Every time one attributes some sort of authority or responsibility to someone, one is treating them as one of us in our community in a particular respect. But no one is accorded every sort of authority or responsibility. This is how we distinguish various people. In specifically recognizing people, in keeping deontic score on them, we're all the time constituting various sorts of virtual communities, recognitive communities to be sure, constituted by the specific aspects of recognition corresponding to the normative statuses that we recognize them as having and we attribute to them. And that's all very complicated. He's got a lot of technical language, but the point that I take from that I'm trying to work with is that membership and what it means to belong to groups, to have membership in, are determined by these types of complex recognitive structures of normative authority. This is about the kind of recognition side, right? What happens when we receive these types of claims, right? I belong, and then other people choose to recognize it, not recognize it, partially recognize it, or so on. Belonging is, in a sense, the opposite side of that, right? It's where the claim comes from. I am a member of this group. I belong to this group, and so on. But it's equally subject to these complex norms and forms and degrees to it. And that's the kind of question that I'm asking here. And then I'm trying to bring, I guess, to understanding what it is to be a member of groups in our society. And so I ask a question that could be summarized in this way. I'm not sure I'm totally happy with this, but what's the meaning of belonging in a complex and diverse liberal democratic state? And particularly following someone like Brahm, what does it mean to claim to belong, right? So if we primarily take belonging as something that people do when they claim it, right? What's the nature of that claiming? What does that claiming involve? What types of obligations do people have to respond to that claim? How do we conceive of or conceptualize claiming or in different ways, right? And how does claiming membership, some type of group, for example, affect the nature of political membership at the level of a diverse liberal democracy? And so I'm trying to get to the point where I can argue that this type of belonging has a kind of structure, right? That there is features of it that different instances, different contextual moments of belonging, whether it's say a subnational group or an ethnic minority or a racial minority, will all share in some sense, like they'll have to fill those out. And that claiming is really key to understanding this structure, because the nature of this claiming is politically significant and very poorly understood, especially, and this is the point I get to, like in terms of its impacts on our forms of citizenship and political community. Now, I'm not going to get to saying everything about all those features. That's the kind of macro question in a certain sense that I'm dealing with and that I'm trying to answer throughout all this work. And it may take a book, I'm not sure at this point in terms of actually doing it. But I'll say something a little bit more about this structure question, because I think it will clarify a lot about what I'm doing here in this paper. So when I say the structure of belonging, at least at this phase, the way I conceive of that is involving at least three things. So every structure of belonging is going to involve subjects, objects, and what I call means or a mode of belonging. So a subject is simply the person who makes the belonging claim, right? It's the one who belongs potentially, right? Now, in a sense, when raising this requires a certain theory of a subject, right? What is it like? What does a person have to have in order to be able to claim to belong? This requires a theory of what it means to be able to claim membership and what other sorts of normative and conceptual resources this requires, right? That's not what I'm dealing with presently, but what's very important about the fact that there are subjects here is that subjects always rely on objects, right? For a person to claim to belong, they have to claim to belong to something, right? So the subject and the object of any belonging claim are in a kind of deep and important relationship. You might even think of it as a dialectical relationship, because they can be in symmetry, right? So I can claim to be a kind of full member of a group, right? I can claim as a citizen, for example, to be a full member of my political community. But claiming can also be in tension, right? That can be part of the claim. I can claim as a racial minority that who's not typical, say, of the national majority, that I belong in spite of it through or in a modified way because of that difference, right? So there can be tensions around that relationship between subject and object, or there can be symmetries, or there can be both in a certain sense. So what's key here is that there is a claim from a subject, but membership, about membership in some object, and that lots of other objects and claims to membership are all kind of involved or at play here as well. Now, the second piece of this that I already kind of mentioned is the idea that there are objects to belonging, right? This is kind of the focus of my present discussion, and I'm moving towards trying to say something about this. So right now, as you'll see, this paper is mostly about what other people have said. Now, this question, or this part of belonging, confronts what sorts of groups do individuals or other groups claim belonging in? What does it mean to be belonged to? What happens when the object of belonging changes, right? Because this can, of course, vary, right? We claim to belong to a variety of things. We can claim to belong to races, to religions, to genders and cultures, and so on. Notwithstanding even political communities or national identities. But what's key here, because I'm interested in developing this kind of political theory of belonging, and I think that we'll see this emerge throughout the paper, is that the object is always, for our purposes, a group that sits in some sort of relationship with the political community and other forms of social membership, right? So whether we're explicitly trying to belong to the political community, or we're trying to belong to some other form of social membership, the point there is the political community always plays some kind of role, right? Because it's our most socially significant form of membership in a sense, particularly when we're like from the perspective of political theory and the questions that I'm asking. Even if the claim is about some other sort of group, the political theory, the political community, I should say, always kind of has some kind of role. And this is really important because it means that in a liberal democratic state, belonging to a group always sits in some kind of a junction between a duality between minority and majority, right? Between those who somehow sit beneath the state or political community and those who somehow sit at the level of it, or the community that's meant to occupy that level. And I'll say something else about how that arises in the literature later on, that minority majority duality. Finally, of course, and this is something I've written about, there has to be some kinds of means or mode of belonging. Now, this isn't the present focus, but I think it's important to keep in mind because it's the lens through which people make these claims, right? By mode or means of belonging, I simply mean a kind of symbolic or imaginative framework that belonging claims move through. This is a kind of intersubjective sphere of meaning, right? Say in the context of a national identity, it'll be the kinds of myth stories of peoplehood and so on that exist. You can use the language social imaginaries. I don't think it's the only one, but it's a good one in terms of its presence in the literature. And I think what someone like Charles Taylor brings to it when he describes it. So he says, he defines social imaginaries as the ways in which people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. And that's important and useful for me insofar as, especially because it shares that kind of normative bent, which is important for people like Brahm and what I'm taking from him, that imaginaries contain these kinds of images, stories, norms, and symbols through which people understand how things occur in their community and the types of claims that make sense, that don't make sense, or that are necessary or not necessary. And for Taylor, of course, these imaginaries also enable common practices. They enable our institutions. They enable public culture as well. And they're key to kind of narratives of legitimacy and non-legitimacy in political communities. From a kind of Brandomian perspective, you can also see in this kind of spheres of conceptual norms that allow people to do the work of claiming, right? People have to access these things in order to do that work of claiming. Right? You have to know something about the kind of national norms or norms of the political community to be able to make claims to membership in it, for example. You have to feed your claims through that. All right. So objects of belonging. So this paper then tries to say something about one of these pieces of the puzzle in a certain sense by talking about objects of belonging and concepts through which we've tended to talk about that. Now, the actual kind of meat of the chapter comes from a forthcoming handbook chapter that I have in a Elgar handbook on multiculturalism that looks at and revisits debates in political theory to examine their implicit and explicit insights for the concept of belonging. And that takes me back to that point that I was making about political theory, where I said that political theory hasn't talked that much about belonging. That's true, but kind of incomplete in a way as a claim. Political theory has not used the term that much, and when they've used, and when political theorists have used the term, they often haven't said what they mean by it. So it's not been explicitly theorized. But some of the work that I've done is about all the implicit claims to belonging in a lot of traditions of political thought, and trying to expose those through looking at debates about citizenship, multiculturalism, institutions, nationalism, and so on, to try and draw out some of these. And this paper kind of reconsider these by framing them in terms of objects of belonging, in terms of what people have argued people belong to and what the nature of belonging to that object is as a result. And tries to then, well, my kind of next step, I guess, is to use that as a way of generally theorizing what an object of belonging is as well. So I'll begin by considering in turn three potential objects, which are prominent in literature, in my view: community, culture, and identity as objects of belonging. So I'll just say something really brief about each of them, just so you kind of understand what I'll go through over the next few minutes. By community, I argue that communitarian arguments in political theory and the way in which liberals responded to them led to a prevailing view that the question of belonging is really a question only of political belonging to a political community, to a national community particularly. I'll then shift to debates about culture that began to problematize this view, and instead emphasize that question of minority belonging and talk about how that distinction was raised and why I think it's useful, as well as what's kind of missing here. And finally, I'll talk about the idea of belonging to an identity, which offers a wider, if vaguer object, which also has been subject to similar types of criticisms, but which offers a more flexible account of belonging, which seems to give a capacity for more diverse types of groups to be thought of as doing this type of work. Okay, so community. As I'm sure many of you know, the liberal communitarian debate of the 1980s and 90s in political theory placed the community and the concept of community at the center of political theory. Now, it arose through a series of critiques that communitarians offered of liberal theory particularly. So communitarians tended to argue that liberals, and often here the figure of John Rawls loomed especially large, but they argue that Rawls and all liberals, or most liberals, ignored community in their accounts of the self in terms of the model of the individual that they use to make their claims about what people are entitled to, what rights they should have, and so on, right? They called these accounts of the self atomistic or asocial accounts of the individual. Liberals on this criticism understood individuals as what they called antecedently individuated. This means that their individual features, their interests, their values, their projects, which are all obviously key features of what liberals are concerned about, were conceived of as prior and independent to social life, right? People are just like this, irrespective of their context, their culture, or their forms of membership. This led liberals, I should say, for communitarians, to view community in either instrumental or kind of sentimental terms. Now, communitarians, in contrast, argued that all individuals were embedded in communities and importantly, using this language, constituted by them. So someone like Michael Sandel, for example, says individuals are defined to some extent by the community of which they are a part. For them, community describes not just what they have as fellow citizens, but what they are. So the key for the communitarian understanding is that individuals belong to communities in particular sets of ways. First of all, that they belong to them in generally unchosen ways, which is a key feature of how they define communities, right? So individuals are thrown into these groups. They're largely unchosen. They have a strong identity-related aspect because they provide a sense of self. And importantly, they include a deep sense of moral connection. So Sandel, for example, talks about how communities deposit moral feelings of connection that binds individuals to them. So there's a deep kind of affective sense to communities. Now, in terms of the theoretical implications of this, belonging to a community in this way has the kind of consequence of seeing ourselves as part of them, right? So this is a kind of identitarian claim and that moral claim that it becomes a kind of primary source of obligation for us. Communitarians then approach belonging to a community as a question of the relationship between individuals and that particular group. And they see that belonging as largely necessary, right? This is unavoidable. This is just how individuals are. We emerge within a community. And the singular there is important insofar as they tend to talk about this as a community, right? Now, the political implications of this, I think, are well known, but worth rehashing a little bit, though I won't go into too much detail. The theory of communal belonging that comes out of communitarianism leads communitarians to very notably reject ideas of state neutrality in favor of what's often called, they don't all call it this, but something like a politics of the common good. Now, state neutrality is obviously a core liberal commitment in the tradition of liberal political thought, right? Framed in terms of belonging, we can think of it in something like these terms, that equality of belonging in a political community for liberals requires state neutrality, right? If we're all going to equally belong, then the state can't be partial to any one of our particular life plans, right? Or values or desires, right? So equality of belonging to the political community requires that type of state neutrality for liberals. Taylor and others argue that this commitment to state neutrality misunderstands political community and its necessary conditions. So any polity for Taylor, not based on domination, so anything that would look like a modern, non-dominating political community, requires a political commitment of members to the state, right? It requires people to sign up to this in some type of way, to feel committed to it. And to also feel committed to their co-citizens. Because modern states can't justify and motivate the sacrifices and demands of citizenship and ensure a kind of flourishing and continuing state unless citizens tie themselves to it, right? He says this, meaning the kind of modern state, entails a willing identification with the polis on the part of citizens. This entails a willing identification with the polis on the part of citizens. It transcends general liberty. I am not dedicated to defending the liberty of just anyone, but I feel the bond of solidarity with my compatriots in our common enterprise, the common expression of our respective dignity, he says. So this is just the point that modern liberal democratic states require a belonging to political community, right? They require people to feel attached, to connect themselves, to have membership in them, right? Now, There's lots of reactions to this claim, obviously, and to this general theory and this type of politics that emerges out of it. With lots of critical responses beyond the scope of what I'm saying presently. But I want to flag up at least two debates that come out of this that are important, and which mainly I'm engaging one of them. On the one hand, this creates a kind of discussion over the most appropriate source of belonging to a political community. This is the question of what has to be shared, right? What motivates that willingness? What area of overlap people have to have in order to be able to do this work, and often then about the normative justification of that area overlap. What can you compel people to share amongst themselves as a body of citizens in order to sign up to this, right? So some scholars, for example, offered the idea that citizens have to share values, right? For them, we all have to feel the same things about democracy or about equality or about freedom. Others said, no, this is wrong-headed. People need, what they actually need to share is a commitment to institutions. Right, so as long as we sign up to the constitutional state and certain types of institutions like the rule of law, then that's enough. And others have said no, people need to sign up to a national identity that involves a kind of cultural tradition, a series of myths, and stories about peoplehood and so on. And I've written a bit about this and described it as a kind of sources debate. It's looking at justified sources. And involves lots of traditions like liberal nationalism, like constitutional patriotism, and so on, and other debates around this. The second debate, though, which is a little bit more important for framing this discussion, takes the kind of framing of belonging and belonging to community to raise a question against communitarians. And that's the question of whether it's right that communitarians talk about communities in the singular in that way, and seem to assume that that community refers to a national political community when they talk about this politics of the common good and this rejection of state neutrality, right? Now this is important because it raises the significance of communal belonging above and below the state in a certain sense, or at least outside of political communities, ones that run alongside them in some type of way. And it raised the question of whether there are other communities that are objects of belonging are tied to that are normatively relevant in this way. And what justifies, and raise the question, what justifies the kind of communitarian assumption that only the community that's associated with the polity and the cultural majority as a consequence is entitled to have that belonging politically accommodated. So it raises that kind of question of minority belonging, the status of culture and identity. So this criticism, as I would say, motivates the kind of emergence or discussion of belonging to culture in political theory. This question of what privileges political communities with a state over other forms of belonging. So Will Kimlicka, who obviously has a lot to say about culture, made this point forcefully. He argued that the communitarian solution, communal belonging to the state, to this problem of political commitment is, as he says, no solution at all. And he argued that it exacerbated minority exclusion, right? A politics of the common good will lead to more people being pushed outside the kind of identities of political community. In contrast, identifying culture as the object of belonging for him appears to be a way of including minority belonging. And this is important because insofar as while this question of belonging to communities is first raised by communitarians, what happens in terms of the way the literature moves is that, at least in the first instance, the debate about belonging to culture starts to be a debate about amongst liberals themselves. It doesn't stay that way, but it becomes about a debate about to what extent people can belong to cultures, how they can belong to cultures, and how the belonging to a culture modifies, say, liberal democratic citizenship, as well as the nature of the political community. And we can see that in Kimlicka's early work. He's motivated by this question in many ways. In some senses, I think he loses this question as he goes on and starts to focus on the solution, which I'll talk about in a second. But you can see that in the first instance, especially from his 1989 work, he finds it to be quite sort of important for thinking about the relationship between liberalism and culture. And you can see that it's a question of belonging. He says, what does it mean for people to belong to a cultural community? To what extent are individuals' interests tied to, or their very sense of identity dependent on a particular culture? And what follows from the fact that people belong to different cultures? Do people have a legitimate interest in ensuring the continuation of their own culture? So for Kimlicka, culture is something individuals belong to and have membership in. And on his reading, liberalism had largely failed to understand the significance of belonging to cultures, especially those of minorities. But, notably, I'm sure you're aware, argues that it has the resources to do this and to institutionally embrace it. Now, I don't want to rehash his argument here, but I would like you to recall his account of societal cultures and his idea that belonging to one entails a kind of meaningful context of choice. So what Kimlicka argued was that liberal freedom requires understanding that individuals belong to cultures, almost irreducibly, right? Everybody does. So we still get that kind of universality claim. That culture is essential, right? And it's essential because it's tied to autonomy and to freedom. He says culture is essential because freedom involves making choices amongst various options. And our societal culture not only provides these options, but also makes them meaningful to us. So belonging to culture is then so important because culture encompasses individual behavior and encompasses our choices, right? So what it means to belong to a culture is to have a series of a delimited set of choices available to us in a certain sense. Obviously a very liberal conception of culture. Now, having established that, he then looks at how he can facilitate minority belonging, right, within the context of a liberal democratic state. And politically, the main institutional mechanism that can recognize belonging to culture for him, particularly belonging to a minority culture, right, because the majority culture doesn't have a problem with doing this. But the kind of mechanism that can recognize this minority belonging institutionally is our rights, right? The creation of certain types of rights, particularly group differentiated rights. As he notes, he says, if individual autonomy and self-identity are tied to membership in one societal culture, developing a theory of rights of minority cultures would seem to be one of the very first tasks of any liberal theory. Now, the connection between rights and belonging can sometimes be implicit in Kimlicka's work. However, the idea, as I see it, seems to be that in the context of multiple cultures within a single liberal state, group rights help minorities belong to both their cultures and the overarching political community by responding to culturally based disadvantage, right? They allow people to continue to be members of their cultures while participating in membership in the political community as well. But importantly, he says these rights are not simply obvious to us or given. There's a kind of contextualism to them and how they emerge. The types of rights that he would argue for and which are justified for him based on this account of freedom and based on this account of cultural belonging, right, depend upon the type of cultural belonging itself. The claims that tend to be associated with that form of belonging and the history of that form of belonging in relation to the majority, particularly. Now, this produces Kimlicka's very well noted distinction between two types of minorities, because there's got to be two. National minorities, which occupies subnational groups like the Québécois or the Catalans or something, or groups like that. On the one hand, and indigenous peoples are then packaged with that in a lot of his works as well, who are entitled to self-determination rights. And then, of course, the other side of that, the other side of the distinction, which is ethnic minorities, who he associates with immigrants and potentially refugees, who he says are entitled to rights to fair integration, right? Now, the distinction itself, with lots to say about it, is not really my concern here. But I am concerned, I guess, with the implications of making the distinction. And there's two, I think, that at least deserve some kind of mention. Sorry, I keep forgetting to change my slide on time, but I'll get you at the bottom part of each one. So two implications. First, his account of societal culture, autonomy, and rights suggests that politically significant belonging to culture is about groups that are largely distinct and relatively homogenous, right? So he doesn't seem to see these cultures or mention these cultures as overlapping, and that tends to be reinforced particularly by the notion of societal culture, which dominates his earlier work. And it seems to suggest that cultural groups are kind of divided from each other, right? And there's like clear kinds of divisions between them, and that they're self-sufficient as a sphere of meaning. It doesn't necessarily suggest a kind of complex overlapping system of belongings, but a fairly distinct one, at least at the level beneath the state, right? But second, his image of culture suggests that belonging to one is politically important. This is, I guess, the more important part of it, and so needs to be responded to a liberal state because belonging to culture comes into conflict with, or you might even say competes with, belonging to the national political community. So he sets up cultural belonging as something that can, unless it's moderated through a system of rights, right, as he wants it to be, but it can be something that rivals political belonging. And so represents a significant challenge to the normative status of the political community, right, and the form of membership that entails. Right now, his accounts here elicited lots of criticisms. some of those raised specters of essentialism, which I mentioned, because we'll come back to that when we talk about identity. But nevertheless, the idea of belonging to a culture raised a really fundamental question about belonging for political theory and for multiculturalism, and for wider groups as well. And that's the question of what it means to belong to a culture when that culture is a minority in the presence of a majority. Our good friend Tarek here calls that the majority-minority duality, or you have called it in at least one place. And that's the question, I suppose, that I think comes out of these debates really importantly, is that when we talk about belonging to culture in the contemporary liberal democratic context, it raises that issue or that understanding of culture as something that sits beneath, right, a political community, and creates a kind of imbalance between a minority who faces in some way a political community. We could call it a majority, right? It may not always function like that, but where it creates a duality between it and this kind of other larger level, which encompasses it in some ways. And this leads to a really important distinction between minority and majority cultures, and a realization that our forms of membership can be subject to these types of relationships. Now, that brings us to our last category, belonging to identity, which I'll have a little bit more to say about than I had to say about the other two. Partly because in some ways it's kind of the more dominant language now. It also tends to cross more of debates that go outside of political theory, so it intersects more with where the language that people use across the social sciences, but also just for reasons I think that I'll say something about here. And in some ways, the debate over belonging to culture and the critique of essentialism, which I kind of only referenced, I don't really have time to go through it, it coincided with a significant focus on another object of belonging. So the idea that we belong not to communities or cultures, but the idea that we belong to identities. Now, identity, just on its face, broadens out the idea of minority belonging, right? It promises a more flexible framing. You could have more different types of groups in, right? Ones that don't necessarily get described as cultures, or which don't, it doesn't make sense to talk about as cultures. Because at its broadest, identity can refer to any kind of social group, right? You can refer to political communities, but it can refer to a variety of social groups that exist alongside those. Still, the question in political theory has tended to be on the way these identities operate in relation to the state and in relation to the political community, and the forms of inequality and exclusion that they experience. Now, I'm going to ask two kind of related questions about what people said about identity, and particularly about what they seem to be saying about what it means to belong to identity. The first is, how is belonging to an identity different from belonging to a culture? Are there significant differences there? And how does the claim change when the object is an identity and not a culture? And second, what is the understanding of belonging implicit in claims to identity? I'm not sure I'll manage to answer either one of those, but those are the ones I'm trying to ask. That makes sense. Now, like community, the centrality of identity in debates in political theory is in large part due, at least in the first instance, to the work of Charles Taylor and his essay, Politics of Recognition. Taylor there describes identity as intersubjective. Belonging to an identity is the result of processes of interaction between groups and individuals. Having an identity is not simply asserting a self-understanding, but being, as he says, quote, in dialogue with, sometimes in struggle against, the things our significant others want to see in us. And this means, of course, that our identity is partly shaped by recognition from others or its absence, right? Now, presently important is how he equates identity with culture in the first instance. For individuals and groups to be authentic to their identities, their culture must be suitably recognized. Taylor notes, just like individuals, a voc should be true to itself, that is, to its own culture. And he says in another moment, belonging to an identity, that's obviously my language, is about, to quote him, the universal potential for forming and defining one's own identity as an individual and also as a culture. So Taylor assumes that identities are primarily cultural in that they contain widely shared meanings and practices. This is why Arias Marion Young calls his understanding substantialist, a substantialist account of identity rather than a relational account of identity, because it brings all this content into it. Despite his language of intersubjectivity. And I think you can see that quite obviously if you go back to Taylor's essay, which I think it's useful to do to remember how this kind of debate begins, right? His primary normative concerns are about the legitimacy of cultural survival as a collective goal and its incompatibility with procedural liberalism on the one hand, and then the argument, the other sort of major concern is the argument that cultures deserve equal respect, right? And he's trying to navigate those. Both focus on belonging as a product of recognizing culture framed in this kind of account of identity. But while Taylor kind of equates identity and culture, other scholars try to drive them apart. And here I'm looking at, I should change this slide. Anthony Appia, who argues that identity is better than culture for understanding group difference. And he often makes the claim in a lot of his works that this is just on its face true, because if we look at the politics around identity and culture, identities often precede cultural differences in terms of the way those politics develop. So the identity seems to emerge first, and then people figure out some cultural differences to support it. But he also notes that identity is significantly overlapping with culture, insofar as it delimits belonging to groups with whom we share complex forms of meaning. But it's distinct on the question of how the group is identified itself. So while cultural difference can surely be an element for him of social identities that make political demands, the concept of identity is better as a framing because it highlights that belonging is about the actual connection to a group, rather than something the group substantively shares or practices together. In this, it's a better overall framing for him for understanding group difference. Because he warns and he kind of notes that there's a lot of slippage in the way that we talk about culture and the way that actually what we're talking about is not culture, but belonging to a culture. He says, using this exact language, there's often a slippage between the idea of culture, simpliciter, and the idea of cultural membership. It might be objected that we have focused too much on the first conception, and that the argument for culture as a good gains plausibility if we give proper emphasis to the notion of membership, of belonging. Now, there are many types of identities. I've said that several times already: racial, cultural, religious, gender, so on. What's important for Appia is the belonging to these groups that we label with identities, right? The concept of identity captures this multiplicity for him, but also this kind of active relation, right? We don't necessarily share a culture with co-members. We may, of course, but we don't. But what we do share is some kind of subjective sense of connection to and membership in a group and the idea of the group, right? And it's an idea that doesn't have to be perfectly shared together, right? It can be contested, it can vary, and so on. And the advantage then of seeing individuals as belonging to identities over cultures is this broadness and this focus on this kind of active connection. Now, he highlights several key points, and I'll be supplementing here with some other scholars' articulations of this, around what this kind of exposes about belonging and belonging to an identity, and about the nature then of membership in these types of groups when we're talking about identity as the object of belonging. The first thing is that there's a deep kind of tension or dynamic or relationship, we might say, between internal sameness and external difference. And Bhikkhu Parakh summarizes this quite well when he says the identity of a thing consists in those constitutive features that define it as this thing or this kind of thing rather than some other, and distinguish it from others. Right? Internal sameness and external difference structure identity. So identity, belonging to identity is being conscious of the way in which you share certain things with those inside and the way in which you're differentiated. And both of those things are always happening. And Parakh is often concerned to make sure that he emphasizes those because other scholars often emphasize one or the other. The second kind of key point there is that belonging to an identity involves a complex relationship between ascription and choice. Some elements of identities are always ascribed by others within the group or by outsiders, and there are always elements of internal reinterpretation and moments of change and some kind of agency as well. And that particularly comes out in this third kind of dynamic where he says that, where we can see that identities are involve complex relations between at least two levels: personal, social, individual identity and collective group identities. So Parakh, for example, very forcefully makes this distinction. He argues that personal identity in modern societies concerns the beliefs, values, behaviors, and attributes that an individual employs to do the work of self-identifying, right? So they'll make a variety of belonging claims in order to do that work of self-identifying and to understand themselves in the world. And so this level of it has a strong dimension of choice, right? Because even though some of these elements will be drawn from collective discourses and identities, some of which are ascribed. Individuals will employ them, Perec says, as intellectual and moral compasses to navigate the task of building a life. But of course, then they're always engaged with that second level, social identities, right? These are the identities that individuals have in virtue of the relationships, the roles, and the membership that they have in some sort of group, and which they're particularly engaged in actively claiming, obviously, in certain moments, or just in assuming if they've already done that kind of claiming work. In principle, any category, right, for Perec, from a visual human characteristic to an occupation can give rise to a social identity. And so the two levels are deeply intermixed. But social identities for him are those that situate individuals and frame how they relate to others in the world, right? They're shared amongst a group in the way that a tradition is shared, right? They're commonly owned in a certain sense, and they participate in particular structures of power and norms around us. That's why he says that they are socially significant and are used to classify individuals. So social identities have common meanings, are structured by norms and expectations, and have definite relations with other social identities. And they're that blend of kind of normativity and power, insofar as they legitimate common sets of beliefs and practices and so on. Now, part of the difficulty of identity here that's coming out of this is that though the interest in political theory concerns social identities in some sense, these are still made up of individuals doing this work of claiming belonging, right? It's individuals who claim to belong to social identities and other ones who ultimately make claims for them, right? About their situation, about what would be a just outcome for them in some context. So it's the relation between individuals and identities to which they belong that is politically significant and which raises a lot of tensions for modern political communities. You can see that with someone like Abigail Eisenberg, for example, who argues that the concept of identity reflects one of the key tensions, she says, that arises in liberal democratic politics between individuals and groups. Identity is used not only to refer to the development of collective self-understanding or group identity, but also to refer to the fragmented self. So individual and collective identities are intertwined and they are indistinguishable. And belonging highlights this kind of messy ways in which we're individuals, but we're also parts of these groups and we're making active connections to these groups all the time. And this is why, in a sense, in our accounts of social identity and political theory, we have to grapple with this interaction between these various levels and how identity kind of connects these levels without reifying kind of either one of them. Now, I'll say something about the kind of political implications of this before moving towards a kind of conclusion. There's some time for discussion. The focus on identity and obviously it listed a lot of criticisms, particularly because of its attachment to the concept of identity politics, which obviously gets deployed in a lot of ways. Now, interestingly, even though identity, I think, in terms of political theory, has often been thought to be a better category than culture in some ways, in the sense that it kind of frees up the way we describe groups, makes them more flexible, is in some senses less essentialist. Obviously, one of the main charges and criticisms that accounts of identity gets is the essentialism charge, right? It's the idea that in encouraging identity groups to make claims and states to react to them, identity politics, as Perec says, imposes on the relevant groups a unity of views and experiences they do not and cannot have. So to justify any political claims, those purporting to represent a group must make claims about the group's identity, right, the nature of belonging to it, while states and institutions in the states have to decide whether to recognize the claims, and they have to make judgments as a result about the accuracy of those belonging claims, right? Is this person a member of this community? Is their characterization of that community situation accurate? Their understanding of, say, their hardship or their exclusion accurate, and so on. So it raises that. And this leads to a couple problems, right? First off, these things ignore the variability and contestation with any group, particularly within an identity. And often when you suppress that contestation, it reinforces internal inequalities. But it also, and this is potentially even more relevant for the question I'm asking here in terms of the framing of political community, it tends to create, for some theorists, false antinomies or false hostilities between this essentialized group and others, right? Perhaps the most worrying, obviously, being the dualism that it can create between oppressed minorities and the state or political community. And once again, Perec is really useful here. He says, since differences are taken to be the basis of identity, they assume an ontological significance. Society gets broken up into exclusive, hostile, and epistemologically closed groups, raising the question of how they are to resolve their differences and conduct their common affairs. So I take a few lessons from this then, from the way these debates have emerged and the criticisms that have been made. On the one hand, belonging to an identity seems to be related to but different from culture, from the idea of belonging to a culture. It seems to raise a kind of non-substantialist view of belonging, first off. It raises a view of belonging that focuses much more on the active connection that members have to have, that people doing the claiming of belonging have to have, and seemingly then kind of focuses more on subjective criteria of claiming rather than objective criteria of sharing something that makes you similar. And identity highlights then that belonging is also this kind of complex process and messy processes that I've outlined around relationships between internal sameness and external distinction, ascription and choice, and the levels of personal and social identity as well. The second kind of lesson that we might take away, though, relates to how the understanding of what we might think of the understanding of belonging that's implicit in claims to identity. Now, following what we've heard here, I think what we can understand is that identity involves, in a certain sense, and political claims to identity involve decontesting an identity in some way, right? Removing that kind of variability, that contestation I mentioned before, and mobilizing an account of it for political ends, right? So this inevitably creates a kind of conflict between levels of belonging, particularly the level between the given social identity and the political identity of the state, right? Both of which will be involved in this kind of claims making. So belonging to identity involves contesting the usual kind of supremacy of the national political identity and bringing up and raising this other identity. They seem to modify it, trump it, or contest it in some sort of way. Now, I've said a lot of things, a lot of abstract things, and I apologize for that again, but I'll just try and conclude now. Let's impose a little bit of unity on all the different points I've made. The relevance of this to me is that I see the debates over community, culture, and identity as potential objects of belonging as kind of exposing a kind of problem, I guess, in the way in which political theorists have tended to talk about belonging. Particularly, it exposes to me that we've tended to think about these different forms of belonging in fairly siloed ways, where we see these as kind of mutually exclusive objects to which we might belong. So debates over community, culture, and identity for me have largely assumed that there is a priority of belonging to political community, right? That's what we're most concerned with. And that belonging to both political community and to cultures and identities, or whatever it is, some kind of other object, right, are not just in tension, but may be incompatible in certain types of ways. That there's a kind of zero-sum relationship between the two of them that has to get squared in a certain sense by a theory. And this often assumes that because political communities and the identities that serve them provide political goods, right, in some type of way, these other kinds of or other social identities, whatever you want to call them, these other forms of belonging and membership, undermine these goals. And my sense is that none of the literatures that I've looked at really largely managed to contest that in a lot of ways. So liberal multicultural theory, for example, doesn't directly challenge that assumption, instead opting like Kimlicka to kind of qualify belonging claims by addressing the status of minority belonging and trying to make it compatible, right, with an overall political identity, and particularly with an institutional model of the state. Identity theorists, in contrast, problematize the assumed priority of political community through a broader account of social belonging that emphasizes the ambiguity and complexity of group belonging, but neither literature is really attempting to overcome the duality itself, right? To understand or to illustrate how belonging can occur in both of these contexts at the same time. And they raise a variety of tensions. And they might be, and I'm not saying they're wrong about this in a certain sense, but just that this is the kind of, I guess, common thread that runs throughout them. And in a sense, the value here that at least I'm trying to grapple with is that I think that these arguments illustrate the kind of multidimensionality of belonging. They also illustrate that to belong to a variety of groups involves a variety of ways of framing claims that has to be taken account of within contemporary politics. Because if we think about how this actually plays out in social and political situations, right, groups will make a variety of claims with different types of objects that overlap with a variety of types of groups, and they'll justify different ends, policies, or goals in relation to how they make these claims, right? So, if we keep that in mind, and what I said earlier about the kind of complex sphere of belonging, always involving interpretations of belonging as it occurs in our society, claims about how that should be modified, and then reactions to those claims, what I think this kind of calls for is a more systematic way of kind of mapping normative criteria that we tend to use around belonging claims in socio-political life, and getting it more explicit than it tends to be. And particularly how that might give us more insights into why groups make certain types of claims to exclusion, how the situation of particular groups leads to experiences of non-belonging, and what types of models of alternative, or more what we might call kind of more inclusive belongings, might ameliorate those in some type of a sense. And I think there's lots of things that are necessary to do that, but I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Clayton. So we can about some questions and points of discussion, including, of course, people online. If you want to indicate by putting a hand up or just making yourself visible and asking your question. So I don't know whether there's someone in the room who's got a question ready or online. I'll kick off by saying something, and let's see how other people come in and where it goes. So what I like about your structure of belonging, with its subject, object, and means, is that it allows for a certain creativity. People make claims. That's part of how you think about subject, someone who makes claims, because they want to belong to the group. They think they belong, they think they have a right to belong. They can also be excluded, and they can be resisting those who are excluding them. And so, as you said at another point, it means that both normativity and issues of power come into play, and you want to be able to have an account of a structure which definitely recognizes that. So I guess my question is that, does that three-part distinction or set of dimensions between subject, object, and means, does it fully capture the dynamic, the creative, and the contestatory feature of belonging? I can see that you're bringing those things in, throughout, and you're making that explicit. But my question really is whether the three-part structure captures it, or you need something else to explicitly emphasize the creative, agential aspects, whether they really are, all those things are really captured in the idea of a subject. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I definitely think it does. Should I answer that now? Yeah. I mean, I had framed it in this way to myself, but I think that aspect's very important. It's something I'm trying to include, because I think one of the interesting things about belonging claims is the new and strange ways they get used that have impacts on everything involved, particularly on that overall framework of meaning that exists around belonging claims. When new claims to belong obviously shift the overall account, in some type of way, and even rejections of them shift the overall account, right? Because they create sort of new norms and new stories to tell in some way. I'm not sure that like the framework as it stands adequately includes creativity, but I guess I can tell you where I think it is. I think that I do feel sometimes that in terms of the three-part structure that I'm missing something. I don't know what it is yet, which is why I keep going back to the methods, as I've said, trying to figure out what that would be. But I do see, I guess, creativity as an aspect of all of them. Particularly obvious. I mean, it would make sense that it would be located in the first instance in a subject. We often, in a lot of social ontologies, see individuals as making, in a kind of traditional liberal model, as being the locus of where experiments and living happen. At the very, in a less kind of theoretically laden way, we can say at least that individuals, when they, as those who have to make claims to belong at some point, will always make them in ways that don't quite fit everything else that people said already. If I take my philosophy of language seriously, right, most things that people say are unique sentences, and as a result, what they'll claim to belong to and how they'll do it will shift with that, and their own particular, especially in complex contemporary societies. We've got lots of overlapping forms of belonging. The way that I will try to participate or see my membership in a group that I might share with you will be different because of my other memberships, right? My understanding of those memberships and what parts of the overall system of norms and concepts I choose to put that in relationship to because they're particularly significant to me. And that might be because of my life, but it also just might be because of the interpretation that I give it, right? So the subject is a big locus of that agency and creativity. But seemingly, I think it occurs in the other two areas quite strongly, right? Because we all belong to similar objects, it creates capacities for agency because we do talk about the same things, right? We're not simply belonging to ourselves as separate entities, right? Because there are objects to which we belong that we share in some sense, even if we see them all these different ways, it creates that capacity for contestation, right? What it means to be Australian won't mean the same thing to me as it will mean to someone else, right? But we'll both think we're talking about the same thing. And because we are talking about the same thing, we'll debate it and contest it. Even if we are maximally inclusive and think that it's okay to be different, we'll still want to talk about it, right? And then there'll still be this kind of site, I guess. The object will remain a kind of site of claiming. So the agency also has to be there in a certain sense. And then, I mean, because I would follow a lot of scholars in the field in seeing that kind of overall, whatever you want to call it, social imaginary as a fundamentally interpretive and normative sphere, which again requires overlap, but doesn't require perfect symmetry between our beliefs and our characterizations and the norms we'll put to play in it. It's necessarily a site of dynamic change.
Yeah, I think you do need that extra, by analogy, you used language and language use. And I also think actually this extra bit that you're now pointing towards will connect your political theory more to sociology, sociologists, because we put words together and say things, but we have to learn a language. So belonging to a language, if that makes sense, or if you like, having a language or what language is, involves a learning process. It involves A, time, and B, relations with other people, beginning with like your parents, but then, you know, school and friends, etc., picking things up off TV and social media and so on. So, because I think your subject, object, and means, just put like that, even though I said I liked it because it had the creative aspect in a way running all through the three, subject, object, and means, what it hasn't got is a account of emergence or the formation of belonging and how some belongings happen without us thinking about them, It's like part of just growing up, just part of being who we are. And then we start thinking about them and develop them, embrace them, reject them, change them. So the agency clearly plays a big role and should do in any account. But we need the background conditions in which the agency comes to emerges and comes to crystallize and comes to be powerful, even if contested by others. And so that's exactly the analogy with language. We come to say all kinds of original things and expressive things, but only as we come to learn a language or more than one language.
Yeah, I suppose that's been my sense of why I wanted to talk about random philosophy, because I feel like, particularly the way you understand how norms arise in language and how people share but also contest norms, is key for understanding what happens around belonging claims as well, and how ultimately, and this is what Braham's interested in, how we start to attribute authority to certain claims, and why we sometimes don't attribute authority to claims, right? And what that means. Because he has a kind of theory about what happens when we see somebody as a speaking partner, someone as something else we can give reasons to, and that's part of learning a language and becoming a language user. And then all the normative relationships that arise, he calls them relationships of responsibility. So, when I speak to you as someone who will understand, at least partially, the norms that I use, the concepts that I use, I also attribute to you a responsibility to be consistent with yourself. You can't say, A is B in one moment and B is C is in the next moment. You sign up to certain claims by making them, and then I follow your line of reasoning, right? And those types of kinds of normative commitments we make, he thinks are really key, right? And I think they're key also to what happens. And they're also key to why belonging claims are messy, because you've got a variety of actors saying a variety of things about groups. And often you get responses from other actors who are part of other groups saying, but others have characterized your group in this way or said this, and then you get contestatory politics around it.
We may come back to language and what we might call context of belonging, context formations. But Mariam Al-Mohammed put her hand up a few minutes ago, so I want to give her a chance to come in at this point. So Mariam, please come in, and if you want to just use the audio, fine, go ahead, or make yourself visible as you wish.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, could be a bit louder, but yes, we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Mariam Al-Mohammed, University of Edinburgh. I teach in language and...
Mariam, that's quite faint. Are you able to increase the volume?
I think, I'm not sure I can...
Sorry?
I don't know how to play with the settings in Zoom. I'm sorry.
It's coming out.
Is it still very, very...
Maybe where, Trace?
Very low? Is it fine like that?
Should I go into the Zoom
It
setting?
might be a Zoom setting, yeah. If you look in the audio,
Okay.
Yeah, it's coming out here. That's what.
All right, it's all a bit complicated, especially as Lauren's been looking up the Zoom. She's somewhere else.
Okay. I
Sorry.
can't find the settings. I'm sorry.
And you find the settings.
I think it has to be done in the room, so don't worry, Mariam. It's we're trying to work it out.
What I'll do is I'll try to hear it, and then I'll repeat her question in a way that's very convenient.
I'll look about with it while you're...
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. I will try maybe to shout a little bit.
Right, so I'll tell Mariam.
Yeah, thank you.
Happening.
Yeah, maybe I could also type thank you. Thank you for this lecture. Okay. And for covering some of the limitations in notions of belonging and an identity. I just feel, I don't know whether you agree on this, that there is actually I feel there is an obsession in Western academia with the duality of minority and majority. And when they talk about identity as a problem, they focus more a problem for the minority. And I heard you saying this many times, but I believe maybe this certain types of identities, whether it's the national identity or the cultural identity, are also problematic for both majority and minority. And it depends also on the context as well. The majority might not subscribe to the state identities, whether these are cultural identities made by states or they are national identity. And I'm thinking in my mind here the Syrian context, because I am Syrian, and I was thinking when you were talking about belonging and identity for different communities, and I can't do the same reading, use the theory you did to position minority and majority in my context. I don't know whether the point is clear. I really like what you talk about language and creativity, because we do work a lot on these ideas in the language and intercultural communication where I teach, and the notion of hybrid identities and whether these hybrid identities are organic or made up by people. And now we see, in what is going on in Palestine and in the media, where people, even the majority, are not subscribing now, let's say, to policies on the macro level. So I hope that my point is clear. I'm sorry that the voice is not good. Okay.
Yes, so could you explain to everybody?
Yes,
what
yeah,
you understand the question to be?
I'm not sure I'll bring to it the richness that Marianne did, but it seems like the main kind of thrust of your question, Marianne, is about my reliance or my reference to the distinction between minorities and majorities, and how that might not play out in the same type of way in other contexts, and that it may be a particular kind of Western, I guess, assumption that would, that wouldn't work in other places, and you mentioned some of them, because of the Syrian context, which I won't claim any great understanding of at all. I mean, Tara and I were just talking about this the other day, the issue of minority-majority politics and how it comes out of an issue of belonging. I think you're right to say, because this is something else you said that I didn't summarize, that a lot of these belonging issues play out for majorities as well. And I don't mean to suggest that they don't at all in a certain sense. So part of what I was saying was that when multiculturalism kind of tried to talk about belonging to culture, they did assume that what belonging to a culture meant was that, or what it exposed at least, was the experience and the structure that exists in a lot of contemporary Western liberal democracies, where you have forms of minority belonging that become politically relevant in the face of a majority. And that's simply to say that when a form of belonging becomes something to be claimed, that experience is motivated by some kind of qualified form of belonging in the overall community. Now, I'm not sure what I think of how this works in non-liberal democratic contexts. There's some very interesting work on, and it's led me to think a lot about the relationship between belonging claims and democracy, because in a certain sense, belonging, the way I talk about it, is only a problem for democracies, right? In feudal societies, people beneath the kind of powerful classes knew the groups that they belonged to, right? And their unequal belonging was non-problematic for them, in the sense they didn't expect anything different, right? Democratic citizenship gives us some kind of understanding or claim that we should have equal forms of belonging. And that raises, in a sense, or politicizes forms of belonging that seem to undermine that democratic citizenship, right? Now, that's not to say that this then only applies in democratic contexts, because the majority-minority duality that I've used maybe doesn't play out in lots of non-Western democracies. But my sense is that what I find valuable about this literature is that it at least raises the idea that one thing we have to understand about belonging claims when they come up, and this is about when they come up and they're made to political communities, right? Is that they're at least often motivated by an experience that group membership has consequences for this group in terms of the way they, in terms of their, what we might call democratic standing, or in terms of how their democratic standing exists at the political level. And that's a kind of aspect of these claims. I can understand in a theoretical sense, but I'd be interested to know about empirical contexts in which that's just not true. Because that might be that I'm quite wrong, which is always the risk of theory. You might just be massively wrong. But thank you. That's a really interesting question.
Adam?
Hi, my name is Erdem. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I have two questions, if I may. So the first one is, does place or geography have any relevance to your understanding of belonging? I'm asking only because some, for example, third or fourth generation of Turkish people living in Germany, they tend to identify themselves more as like Berliners than Germans or Turks or Muslims, whatever. So does geography have any relevance to your understanding of belonging? And my second question is, so from a multiculturalist point of view, do you think we can legitimately talk about hierarchy of belongings? So how do we respond to claims around, multiple conflicting belongings?
Okay, great questions. I would say a broad yes to both of them in a sense. Geography is massively relevant. It comes into a lot of belonging claims. It doesn't come into every belonging claim. So I would see it as something that can be mobilized in a belonging claim in the same way that history gets mobilized in lots of belonging claims, right? So in a lot of belonging claims, issues of historical injustice loom incredibly large, right? My citizenship to the contemporary state, my membership in the community is compromised by the historical injustice that my community suffers from. See that saturated throughout, for example, indigenous politics, right? And the idea that say colonialism and the creation of settler states, has had huge implications for that, and for these groups' sense of their belonging to their own groups, but also the way in which they partially belong to say political communities as well. And of course, geography then could be mobilized in certain ways. Do I think it always has to be? Is it like a necessary connection? I don't think necessarily, because lots of groups that we belong to don't necessarily have locations in the same type of way. We may see there, I mean, is it ever completely absent? Like, even if you're talking about belonging to a transnational religion, I guess that religion might have particular sites of significance. So it's never gone, but it never sits in the center. It doesn't have to sit in the center, I guess. Of course, when we talk about the territorial states, then geography becomes very important. And belonging claims obviously get mobilized around border politics, around contested borders in huge ways, right? So I think there's lots of connections. And that's why there's actually one of the disciplines where people have talked about belonging a lot is in geography. And that's because the connection to place, I think, looms large. Because I'm not only interested, I guess, in the idea that belonging is something that we subjectively experience. I mean, that's there, and I'm not contesting that. But the idea that belonging as an act of claiming is something that structures how people talk and how people engage with others in political communities, then the connection to place gets deployed, emphasized or de-emphasized in certain moments, depending on what the claim is, right? And what the group is that's doing the claiming. Well, does that kind of answer your question? Yes. Kind of a yes, but not necessarily, or it's just different degrees. Hierarchical belonging. In a sense, I think that's the problem of belonging, right? Is that it plays out mostly in hierarchical ways. And I'm not sure it actually, in a certain sense, could never do that to some degree. Because there's always that mode of belonging that exists. It has a history, probably has been unequal, given the history of most of our societies. Could it be more equal? Yeah, definitely. Will it ever be perfectly equal? I don't know. Maybe not, probably not. Those things don't seem to happen. So I think the problem of hierarchical belonging is key. And so I would be motivated by people identifying that. The thing that I'm interested in some ways, is whether in every sphere of life, and I don't know the answer to this question because I haven't gotten the kind of normative theory part of it, but in every area of life, whether democratic citizenship justifies that the goal be a perfectly non-hierarchical form of belonging. Right? I don't know if that's true. Lots of politics, even ones we find it to be emancipatory in some way, still contain accounts that seemingly create new hierarchies, right? If we think of liberalism, which tried to, in a very significant way, rewrite the kind of normative hierarchy of modern Western life, right? Away from feudal societies and towards whatever we have now, created new hierarchies, right? Often in ways we didn't anticipate, right? It created the idea of a democratic majority who, and then we've come to grips with the fact that that creates minority forms of belonging who then claim that these hierarchies have impacts for them. So I think it's important that that hierarchy is kind of a foundational problem, but I'm not sure it's a solvable one in that sense. So for multiculturalists, I think we have to be motivated by that. And I'm not sure what would solve it, but I think there's better, for sure, in the forms of kind of inclusive belonging. And I've written a little bit about ideas of multicultural nationalism, picking up on what Tarek has done. It's a step in a direction that I think is better. But will it be perfectly non-hierarchical? I'm not sure. Probably not. The capacity for people to experience belonging claims which sound inclusive as non-inclusive is, I think, part of human creativity, probably, to go back to that.
Maybe I could pick up where we were about language, and in particular, think about ways that we could connect political theory with more sociological approaches.
Yes.
So one of the things that you brought out in your brief account of what Brahm has to say about language and making claims within language, and how that could be a kind of analogous conceptual frame for thinking about belonging, was that, of course, there are all kinds of norms at work in language, and that also means that there are forms of authority. I mean, very crudely, I mean, there are dictionaries, but in general, I mean, we learn language from other people, and we also teach it to other people, and so on. So at the very least, there's a kind of, authority of teacher and learner. So the question then is, okay, that's quite positive. I like that, but many sociologists would want to know how that would give us a handle, or does it give us a handle on thinking about the power relations, which are even more significant when we think about belonging, and you just talked about hierarchies of belonging, than even about language. And it may be that we do or don't want to begin with some of the people that you mentioned at the very beginning, that you said you'd written about, but didn't want to bring, you weren't talking about them here. Well, broadly, what we might call people who talk about a critical politics of belonging. They tend to be influenced by an approach that says, let's problematize something, belonging in their case, or it could be something else. Now, my sense is that what they end up doing, there can be a soft problematizing and a hard problematizing. So a soft problematizing I think of as, let us interrogate, let's ask questions about how this works or how this has come to be. But sometimes they go much further, following certain kinds of social theory approaches, where they actually rob the object of analysis of its authority claims making. So it all becomes about power and the power to tell other people what to do, to exclude them, to give them a lower status, or to create rights of entry, or more than rights, requirements, entry requirements, and so on. And of course, yes, all those can be in play. And you think, well, but how are you going to relate all this power to authority? And on the whole, the kind of the hard approach tends not to make much of that relationship, because it robs that political activity of its legitimacy. And so problematizing means for them delegitimizing.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one thing, one way that we may do it or may avoid doing it, but how would you want to, and if you like, following your sense that Brandam's got something to offer here, how are we to relate issues of power to issues of norms and authority?
Big questions.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's kind of, in a way, it would be the bridge towards more sociological work.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds almost as if the question is about whether Brandam, and maybe I'm wrong, but this is what you're asking about, whether Brandam gives us a different theoretical language for mapping, say, the normative structure of a context, maybe one that's not as theoretically laden with claims to delegitimization necessarily, or more descriptive in that sense, or whether Brandam can kind of make that jump to kind of a normative argument about what's more legitimate or less legitimate in terms of a model of belonging, for example. I don't know if Brandam can do that. He's not a normative theorist in the sense of a theorist that's trying to produce better justifications for things. He's a normative theorist insofar as he wants to produce an account of normativity and how it arises in language. But generally, not telling you, what's a good form structure of authority in language or not. He does, at certain moments, suggest that his work has that implication, but doesn't pursue it himself. And interestingly, the suggestion he makes intersects with some of what you said before from a different angle. And that's the fact that one thing that Brandon is very interested in is normative creation. He's very interested in how and why languages lead to new novel types of normative claims. And that's why I think it's interesting, because he gives us a kind of a vocabulary for saying why people can claim to belong in ways that will shift identities, that will shift the way people understand what the groups are. But he also suggests that capacity for openness is in its sense one of the main guiding norms that we get out of modern Western philosophy that he thinks is useful. That capacity for creative innovation. And it makes our that in itself is kind of the normative base that could be taken forward. He sees it as kind of democratic in a broad sense, right? Capacity for innovation, to say something, capacity to deploy norms. I'm not sure how that would intersect with some of the perspectives you're talking about. It sounds a little bit sometimes like when you're saying, maybe you weren't doing this, that it was a description of Foucault and Foucauldian approaches, partly because you're using the language of problematization.
So you picked up the subtext.
Yeah, maybe my subtext. I don't know. There are several Foucauldians in my department, so it may just be that I'm used to getting these kinds of questions. But it's interesting because Brandam and Foucault share a lot. They share an emphasis on social normativity, right? Foucault has his own language about it, and he connects it to ideas of power. Brandam, I don't think, ignores that power exists, but he doesn't claim to explain that. But it's related, right? Because Brandam says look, my account of norms tells you how authority arises in language, right? And tries to give you a way of talking about why the certain uses of concepts become authoritative and why other uses of concepts don't, right? Why, for example, or how we map why, say, the negative conception of freedom in modern Western societies came to stand in for a lot of people, especially say in Anglo-American debates, for what freedom is in general, you know, how that captured in a certain sense. Now, whether that's a good or a bad understanding of freedom, I mean, he actually does have something to say about freedom, but at least on a strictly kind of Brandoian framework, isn't necessarily entailed by what he thinks. But Brandom's written about Foucault, and what he doesn't like about Foucault particularly is he thinks that Foucault misunderstands the relationship between freedom and constraint. And he thinks that Foucauldians misunderstand the relationship between freedom and constraint. Now, I don't have his full argument immediately in my mind to deploy to you, but I would suggest if you ever have some time and you're interested in that question, there's a great essay called Freedom and Constraint that he wrote that responds implicitly to a lot of Foucauldian understandings that were emerging in Anglo-American political philosophy in the 1980s. And he writes this big history of freedom and its relationship with the concept of constraint going from Kant, Hegel, and into kind of 20th century philosophy. And he basically argues for what we might say is a positive conception of freedom, right? Like that freedom and constraint are dialectically related to each other. They require each other. There's no such thing as freedom without constraint. And so we have to be skeptical of an analysis that would see normative structures in the way that he understands Foucault would see normative structures, right? As, yes, positively enabling, but always a kind of thing to be, but only identifiable by resistance, which is Foucault's ultimate point, as I understand it, right? That so domineering that it's only where you see, say, if we put this in the language of belonging, right? A Foucauldian might say it's only where you see how where people are claiming something different that you can see the hegemonic hierarchical form of belonging that pushes them down all the time, right? Because that's the contestatory aspect. Brandom, I think, would want to say, yes, I mean, you do see that in those moments, but you also see a much more complex account of contestation that's going on all the time, and a much less hegemonic understanding that would always be enforced there, because authority in language is for him something that is always subject to a variety of claims that we need to map. And that there's always other sources of authority. And that's why language changes. And some of it's not about overt resistance. Some of it's just about saying something in a different way or saying something again, which necessarily changes it for him.
No, thanks, Clayton. We can at this point stop and have a drink, carry on a conversation over drink. But if you wanted to ask a question, which I think you don't, okay, so you made up your mind. So thank you very much. Let's just give Clayton a final thank you. Thanks. Yeah, do stay for a drink.